In history textbooks, Abraham Lincoln is remembered as the man who steered America through the Civil War and forever abolished slavery. His image, tall, solemn, with the black stovepipe hat and the steady gaze, has long since become a symbol, frozen in bronze and marble. But in the archives of the National Library, there are documents never woven into the official biographies. They describe Lincoln differently, not only as a president, but as a witness, and perhaps even a participant, in events that defy explanation. The trail begins in 1827, when a 15-year-old Lincoln was working at a steam-powered mill in Illinois. That year, according to the diary of a neighboring farmer, the dense woods beyond the mill hosted a gathering of people speaking in a language I could not place, each wearing an identical silver medallion. The entry, written in a careful hand, was filed away and ignored for almost a century. No follow-up, no local gossip, just that single unnerving account. The real fracture in Lincoln's story, however, came in the spring of 1862. By then, the nation was tearing itself apart in war. Yet, in the midst of mounting battles and political crises, the president slipped away from the White House under the cover of night. He left the day-to-day governance to his aides and traveled north, unannounced, to the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg, more than a year before it became etched into history by his famous address. Residents later swore they saw him after midnight, walking with 3 men in long black overcoats. None of these companions were recognized as members of his cabinet or military staff. They led Lincoln along a deserted rail spur toward an old storage warehouse that had been shuttered for years. What happened inside was never officially recorded, but multiple witnesses claimed to have seen the group emerge carrying a massive wooden crate bound in blackened iron straps. It took all 4 men to maneuver it onto the bed of a covered wagon, its canvas drawn so tightly that no shape of the contents could be made out. Without speaking to anyone, they departed into the fog. 2 days later, Lincoln reappeared in Washington. The trip is absent from any formal record, as though it never occurred. What was in that crate? Why would a sitting president involve himself directly in its transport? And what possible link could it have to decisions and movements for which there is no trace in conventional history? The first clue surfaced decades later, in 1909, during renovations to one of the oldest sections of the White House. In a dust-choked basement room, behind a wall of rotted shelving, workers found a sealed trunk. Inside were several bundles of letters written in Lincoln's own hand. These letters are unlike any others in his known correspondence. They do not mention the war, legislation, or political rivals. Instead, they speak of something Lincoln calls the keepers, and of what he names the secret of the four. The tone is not rhetorical or political. It is urgent, almost pleading. In several passages, he warns of a trust that cannot be broken without consequence, and describes diagrams that no historian has yet fully deciphered. One letter, dated April 21, 1862, contains only a single sentence. The first gate is opened by the hand that refuses to be seen. It is this date that takes us back to the night in question, back to the warehouse by the railway, back to the moment when a president stepped outside the boundaries of his elected duties and into the shadows of something older, stranger, and far less understood. Our investigation begins there, with the first location, the first recorded movement of an object that should not exist, a place where, officially, the President of the United States never set foot. April 21, 1862. The Civil War was at its height, yet Abraham Lincoln, against all protocol, was spotted far from Washington, traveling without his guards, without the presidential entourage, and without any mention in the public record. That night he appeared in Harper's Ferry, a small, mist-shrouded town on the border of Virginia and Maryland. According to preserved entries in the railroad archives, the president did not arrive on a passenger coach. Instead, he came in aboard a freight train, manifestly assigned for transporting military equipment, an unorthodox, and, for a sitting president, dangerously exposed choice. Local residents later recalled that the town had been swallowed that night by a fog so thick the glow of the gas lamps dissolved into nothing just a few steps away. The air was wet and metallic, carrying the faint odor of burned coal drifting from the rail yards. Lincoln himself was seen only once, a tall figure, unmistakable in his stovepipe hat and long coat, emerging from the steam of the depot alongside 3 other men. These men, dressed in heavy black coats that concealed their faces, kept close to him as they made their way toward the shuttered industrial quarter. One witness, George Milton, a night porter at the station, recorded an odd detail in his personal diary. He wrote, "They carried a crate, but it was too quiet. No rattle of iron, no shifting of wood. It breathed." From this point forward, the night splinters into scattered fragments of testimony. In the police log of Harper's Ferry, there is an entry for repeated nocturnal noises resembling hammer blows, coming from the ruins of the old armory, an installation destroyed in the infamous raid of 1859 and never rebuilt. Another notation in the same book references an unknown shipment loaded onto horse-drawn wagons and driven west toward the shadowed ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains. No manifest, no description, just a single word underlined twice: urgent. What happened in those hours is unknown. By the time dawn came, the fog had thinned, the streets were empty, and there was no sign the president had ever been there. But exactly 1 week later, Lincoln convened a closed-door meeting in the White House. No aides, no generals, just 4 men whose names remain redacted in every surviving document. Records in the National Archives confirm only the duration: nearly 12 continuous hours behind locked doors. And when those doors finally opened, 3 sealed caravans departed Washington at once, each heading in a different direction across the United States. Their destinations were unlisted, their contents unrecorded. Why would the President of the United States gamble his safety, traveling deep into contested territory in wartime, to personally oversee the movement of a mysterious crate? Why were all records of his travel in those days erased from official journals? And who were the 4 men with whom he held that marathon meeting? The first trace of an answer lies not in Washington, but in a set of military dispatches from the archives of Jefferson County. Files that survived purely by accident, misfiled in a box of agricultural reports. In them is a cryptic reference to one of the caravans and its final stop, a location tied to the oldest mine in Virginia. That mine, according to local folklore, yielded more than just ore. Old miners' tales speak of stone that sings when struck, and of tunnels that were bricked over, not because they collapsed, but because something deeper was found, a vein of material that the earth itself seemed reluctant to give up. It is toward that mine that we must now follow Lincoln's trail, knowing only that whatever came out of Harper's Ferry on that fog-drenched night was not simply cargo, but something worth hiding across centuries. The old Chester mine, tucked deep in the folds of the Blue Ridge Mountains, was officially abandoned in 1834. The reason entered into the public record was straightforward, at least on paper: a catastrophic cave-in that claimed the lives of 5 miners. The mine was sealed, its equipment sold off, and the incident quietly folded into the long list of industrial accidents of the era. But buried in the archives of the Virginia Mining Bureau lies a detail that has never made its way into history textbooks. Exactly 1 month before the fatal collapse, every single sample of ore extracted from Old Chester was confiscated by military officers. The crates were loaded under armed guard onto wagons, and whatever their destination was, it was not recorded. The trail ends in a single word, written across the final ledger: secured. Almost 30 years later, in April of 1862, Old Chester stirred again. Armed detachments, uniforms without insignia, were seen moving through the forested ridges surrounding the old works. Witnesses from nearby farms claimed they pitched canvas tents near the abandoned adits and began unloading supply crates. Among these crates was one that drew particular attention: a massive wooden chest banded in steel, its lid engraved with a symbol unlike any known mining or military marking. It was a circle, quartered into 4 equal sections, the same enigmatic emblem that would later appear in Lincoln's private letters and in the few surviving notes about the so-called secret of the 4. The mine entrance was cleared with unusual precision. Rotten timbers were replaced with fresh oak beams. New supports were driven deep into the earth. On the surface, sentries were posted in a wide perimeter, far enough that no civilian could glimpse the work being done inside. According to entries in the logbook of the Jefferson County Sheriff, strange noises began 2 days after the guards took up position, not the groan of timber under strain or the distant rumble of rockfall, but sharp, metallic impacts, as if something inside the mountain struck back. Alongside the clangs came a low, sustained hum, felt more in the bones than heard with the ears, that carried as far as the nearest village. Farmers complained their livestock grew restless at night, pacing in their enclosures without reason. Then came the night of April 27th. By morning roll call, an entire section of the guard was missing. Their tents remained neatly pitched. Inside, rifles were stacked with military precision. Boots, placed side by side, sat at the foot of each cot. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks led away from camp. It was as if the men had simply stepped out of their uniforms and ceased to exist. Within a week, the entire operation vanished as suddenly as it began. But unlike the closure of 1834, Old Chester was not left to decay naturally. This time, the shaft was sealed beneath an unbroken slab of poured cement, several feet thick. No markers were left. No records of the final day's work survive in official archives. Even local newspapers, so fond of mining gossip, made no mention of the military presence, or the fact that, for those 2 weeks, a remote corner of the Blue Ridge was under effective martial law. Why, in the middle of a war tearing the nation apart, would the President of the United States see fit to send a guarded shipment to a long-dead mine? What lay within those tunnels that required not merely guarding, but complete isolation from the world? The only surviving hint comes from a single handwritten note, the sole page rescued from the effects of an Army engineer whose name was omitted from his own service record. The scrap surfaced in a private collection in 1948. The writing is spare, the ink browned with age. A stone not of this earth. 4 who know its true name, and the one who carries it will not remain unchanged. Whether that stone was ore, artifact, or something stranger entirely is unknown. But the choice of words, true name, suggests it was more than a physical object. In certain traditions, to know the true name of a thing is to hold power over it. If so, the 4 men Lincoln met with after Harper's Ferry may not have been his advisors or generals at all, but the last living keepers of a knowledge buried in the mountains long before the war, and buried again under cement when it threatened to surface. Beneath the White House lies a warren of rooms rarely mentioned on guided tours. Some are storage spaces, some long-forgotten wine cellars, and some, if the oldest blueprints are to be believed, date back to the earliest days of the Republic. One such space, now used as nothing more than a maintenance storeroom, was once known simply as Room Number 4. Narrow, without windows, its only exit led into a brick corridor so old that its mortar crumbled at the touch. In the mid-19th century, this unremarkable chamber was not a place for mops and crates, but for something, or someone, that required secrecy and watchfulness. The archives of the Office of Public Buildings preserve a faded inventory sheet, dated May 1862, cataloging the usual supplies of the time. Ink, 2 barrels. Candles, 48. Nails, 6 pounds. But tucked between these mundane entries is a single line that defies explanation. Stone, 1. Temporary storage. Access restricted. The weight is recorded, 312 pounds, and, unusually, the storage location is specified. Room Number 4. The document bears a signature at the bottom, written in a hand that is instantly recognizable. A. Lincoln. Why would the President of the United States personally certify the receipt of a stone? What was its origin, and why was its storage temporary? A fragmentary answer surfaces in the memoir of Thomas Pennington, a junior assistant librarian of Congress. Pennington recalls a night when he happened to be in the White House basement, delivering ledgers, and saw President Lincoln descending the steps with 3 men. All 4 wore long black overcoats and gloves, despite the mild weather. More unsettling was what each man carried, a silver medallion marked with the same quartered circle symbol that would later appear in Lincoln's mysterious letters about the keepers. Pennington writes that after they entered room number 4, a sound began to seep through the heavy door, neither fully music nor entirely mechanical. It was at once a deep organ-like resonance and a distant hammering, like iron striking from within stone. Minutes later, the door opened. The men emerged, carrying an object swathed in thick black cloth, the unmistakable bulk of something heavy and rigid beneath. That same month, Lincoln issued an unusual order, halting all construction and maintenance work in the White House basements until further notice. Access to the sublevels was to be restricted to a list of 4 names. The list has not survived, but a passing mention of it appears in a private letter from an Army engineer to his brother, proof that it existed. According to scattered sources, the stone was removed from room number 4 on the night of May 14, 1862. Where it went is not recorded, but that date marks a turning point. From that night onward, Lincoln began writing his strange private notes about the keepers and the secret of the 4. What happened in the hours between its removal and dawn is a story the official histories never tell. But for Lincoln, it was the moment when the burden he carried as president became something far more secretive and far more dangerous. The night of May 14, 1862 was moonless. Low clouds pressed down over Washington, and rain, steady, cold, and insistent, had been falling for nearly 24 hours. Above ground, the White House was silent. Hallways were dark, offices empty, and the faint smell of damp spring air seeped in through cracks in the old window frames. But in the basements beneath, according to the rare witnesses who later dared to speak, there was movement, purposeful, urgent, and hidden from all but a handful of eyes. Shortly after 11 o'clock, a covered carriage rolled through the east gate. It was drawn by 2 black stallions draped in thick rain cloaks, an old military trick meant to conceal identifying marks. 4 mounted escorts flanked the carriage, each wearing a long oilskin coat and a tall black hat that made them nearly indistinguishable from one another in the rain. The carriage did not stop at the main entrance. Instead, it circled to a narrow side passage leading directly to the service doors of the basement. President Abraham Lincoln was already waiting there, his towering frame casting a thin, wavering shadow in the lamplight. In one hand, partly hidden by his coat, he clutched a silver medallion, the same one he was rumored to carry at all formal events, though few had ever seen it up close. The cargo was unloaded without a word. Even under the heavy black tarpaulin, its bulk was unmistakable. The stone that had been sealed in room number 4 for weeks. It was placed atop a low copper pedestal in the center of the room. The pedestal itself was unlike any official government furnishing, its surface engraved with a repeating pattern of symbols belonging to no known language, some curving in spirals, others jagged like fractured lightning. Once it was set, the escorts left. Only Lincoln and 3 other men remained behind. They shut the heavy door from the inside and barred it. What happened next is known only through fragmentary accounts and the recollections of one military engineer, whose private notes surfaced decades later. According to him, within minutes, a deep, resonant vibration filled the room, so low it was felt in the ribs rather than heard in the ears. It grew until it seemed to pulse through the very brickwork. At exactly midnight, something happened that could not be explained away as coincidence. 3 miles to the south, in the district where the military hospital stood, every clock stopped. For 60 full seconds, the second hands froze. Kerosene lamps sputtered out on their own, their flames vanishing as if smothered by invisible hands. Back in the White House, those in the basement claimed the air grew heavier, pressing down on lungs and shoulders. The copper pedestal grew warm. The engraved symbols along its edge began to darken, as if ink were bleeding up through the metal itself. And then, silence. By dawn, the stone was gone. Room number 4 stood empty except for 2 things: the silver medallion, lying face down on the floor, and a dark, irregular stain at the exact center of the pedestal's former position. The stain resisted all efforts to remove it: water, solvents, even acid. It remained like a shadow burnt into the floor. 2 days later, Lincoln began composing the first of his now infamous private letters, those addressed only to the cryptic keepers and centered on something he called the secret of the four. The very first letter ended with a single unsettling sentence, written in his own steady hand. "We have opened it, but it has not yet opened us." It was the beginning of a correspondence that would span the rest of his presidency, one that the official histories would never acknowledge, and that would vanish into locked archives after his death. The letter dated May 16, 1862, discovered in 1909 in a sealed trunk in the White House basement, was addressed to a man named Edgar M. Hult. No official record exists of Hult in military rosters, government payrolls, or political appointments. His name appears nowhere in the correspondence of known Civil War figures. And yet, in 3 unrelated private journals from the period, witnesses described a man of identical appearance, tall, gaunt, dressed in a long black coat, wearing a silver medallion over his chest. The letter was written entirely in Lincoln's own hand. "Edgar, we did all as was commanded. The four were gathered, and the stone revealed its light. I saw shapes that do not belong to our time. They stood beyond a door that could not be seen, yet was in the room. We have held it, but I fear it has also held us." The implication is chilling, that on the night of May 14th, those present had performed some kind of act or ritual in room number 4, one that caused the stone to display properties far outside the realm of known physics. In fragments from other letters, Lincoln elaborated. The surface of the stone began to glow from within, at first with a soft, pale white light. Over the course of minutes, that glow deepened to red, then to a consuming black, a darkness that absorbed the lamplight around it. Most disturbing is his mention of the 4 voices. Lincoln writes that every man present heard a voice speaking in an unknown tongue, yet each was certain the words were addressed to him alone. The speech was not merely incomprehensible, it was personal. One of the men, Lincoln noted, collapsed mid-ceremony. He remained unconscious until dawn. When he finally awoke, his hair had turned completely white, and his eyes no longer reacted to light. In the days that followed, each of the 4 experienced strange and unsettling symptoms. Lincoln complained of whispers in the walls of his residence and of a deep cold in his hands, even during the summer heat. Another participant, believed to be Colonel John M. of Baltimore, vanished entirely from his locked home. His door was bolted from the inside, the hearth still warm, and on his desk lay only his silver medallion. Official records state that roughly a month after the events of May 14th, the stone was relocated as part of archival reorganization. The unofficial account, passed quietly among certain circles, claims it was moved to a hidden chamber beneath the old Springfield Armory in Illinois, Lincoln's hometown. By July 1862, Lincoln's surviving correspondence ceases to mention the stone directly. Instead, his letters speak cryptically of the coming return. He insists that the secret of the 4 is not merely the knowledge of the stone's origin, but the duty to guard what is contained within it. Something, he warned, that couldn't be allowed to emerge. Years later, after Lincoln's assassination, renovations to the Springfield Armory revealed a vacant copper pedestal, identical to the one once kept in room number 4. The stone itself was nowhere to be found. The last known trace surfaces in an 1898 photograph, 4 men standing before a weathered barn in rural Illinois, each wearing a silver medallion engraved with the 4-sectioned circle. One of the faces bears a striking resemblance to Edgar M. Hult, a man who, according to every official source, had been dead for 26 years. What happened in that locked basement room on May 14, 1862? The evidence suggests the 4 did not merely open a container or examine an artifact. They opened something else, something that, in turn, had opened them. And perhaps that is the true meaning of Lincoln's words, that the secret of the 4 was never theirs to keep. The stone knew them, it remembered, and it was waiting. After Abraham Lincoln's assassination in 1865, all of his personal effects were inventoried and passed to his widow, Mary Todd Lincoln. Among the listed possessions was a small metallic medallion engraved with an unfamiliar symbol. In the official paperwork, it was described blandly as a family keepsake. No mention was made of its origin, nor of Lincoln's connection to the men who once wore such medallions in the basement of the White House. Within a year, it was gone, vanished from the Todd Lincoln household without explanation. 13 years later, in Springfield, Illinois, the medallion's shadow seemed to stir again. On the night of November 4, 1878, a local farmer reported seeing an unnatural light flickering inside the weathered barn that now stood on the grounds of the former Springfield Armory. Curiosity pulled him closer. As he reached the doors, they swung open on their own, revealing a single object in the center of the darkened space, a massive, black stone resting on a low copper pedestal. The farmer later wrote in his diary that the stone's surface rose and fell as though it breathed. In the faint glow, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection, but the eyes in that reflection were not his own. 2 days later, the farmer vanished. His bed was unmade, the hearth still warm, and on his kitchen table lay only a few hurried notes describing the 4 who came in the night. His disappearance was never formally investigated. By the end of the 19th century, direct sightings of the stone had grown rare. Yet strange patterns began to emerge. In several families tied by blood or marriage to Lincoln's inner circle, children were born with the same unusual traits: unnaturally pale skin, pale irises, and faint scar-like marks across their palms. Some of these children grew into adulthood, only to vanish themselves, often leaving behind nothing but a single silver medallion. In 1901, during renovations on a private residence in rural Illinois, workers broke through a false wall and discovered a small wooden box. Inside was a sepia-toned photograph of Lincoln. The image was distorted, the background unnaturally darkened, his face illuminated only by an unseen source, and in his eyes, what looked like the reflection of flames. On the back, scrawled in faded ink, were the words, "The secret does not die. It waits." This phrase has since become the rallying point for modern researchers who claim that the stone, and those sworn to guard it, still exist. If the old accounts are true, the guardians return every few generations, not by choice, but by some binding force, to finish what was begun in that basement room on May 14, 1862. 1921, Springfield, Illinois. The city was preparing to mark the 50th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's death. The central square was draped in flags and portraits, speeches were planned, bands rehearsed. But away from the festivities, in the older part of town, something happened that no newspaper ever mentioned. According to sealed Springfield police records, sometime between the night of April 18th and the early hours of April 19th, an alarm was triggered in the basement of a building constructed on the site of the former Springfield Armory. When officers arrived, they found the door smashed open and the room inside completely empty, except for a massive copper pedestal coated in decades of dust. Resting on the pedestal was a single fresh white glove. Beside it, a handprint pressed deep into the metal, as though it had been soft when touched. Along the edge of the pedestal, someone had scratched a now familiar emblem, a circle divided into 4 sectors. The police inventory noted one more detail. On the floor, near the pedestal, lay a torn scrap of paper. Scrawled in black ink were the words, "The 4 have returned." The handwriting, when compared years later, matched that of Abraham Lincoln, despite the fact that nearly 6 decades had passed since his death. Rumors swept the city. Some residents swore they'd seen figures in long black coats moving in perfect unison through the streets that night, as if following a route memorized long ago. Within weeks, disappearances began in the outskirts of Springfield. 3 people vanished without a trace, each last seen near an old barn built on the foundation of the former armory. A photograph of one of the missing later surfaced in a private collection. In the blurred background stood a dark, monolithic shape in the corner of a room, its outline too distinctive to be mistaken for anything else. This event leads directly to the next link in the chain, the archives of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In the 1930s, for reasons never explained to the public, the Bureau began quietly collecting reports on what they called the Springfield artifact. It is in those files that we find the last official reference to the stone, before it vanished from the record entirely for the rest of the 20th century. Early 1933, Chicago, Illinois. According to internal FBI files, a new operation was quietly opened under the title Project Springfield. Its official mandate: to investigate rumors of a relic of national significance. But in the agent's informal notes, another name appears over and over: Case 4. The first step was a complete seizure of Springfield's municipal records connected to the old armory and anything built on its foundations afterward. Witnesses to the events of 1921 were brought in for questioning. Most later claimed that their interrogators weren't ordinary agents at all, but men without faces. Men who wore dark glasses indoors, spoke in short, perfectly measured phrases, and never referred to each other by name. One report describes agents entering the basement of the barn, built over the armory site, and finding a metal container, its exterior sealed with a thick coating of lead. It was opened on the spot. The documents are silent on what was inside, but in the very next paragraph, there is mention of an unexplained heat surge and the immediate evacuation of the entire building. From that moment on, the Springfield investigation was moved to a special classification level. Every file, photograph, and witness statement collected under Project Springfield was transferred to Washington. Yet in 1941, during a massive internal audit of FBI archives, it was discovered that the entire Case 4 dossier had vanished. Only one document survived: a single, half-burned sheet. The legible lines read, "Must remain 4. If one leaves the circle, another will appear. The stone is never alone." Agents who had worked the case soon became linked to a series of strange and violent incidents: a car accident on a clear road, a fire that gutted an apartment in minutes, and the unexplained disappearance of one operative from his locked hotel room. Within the Bureau, an unspoken rule took hold. Case 4 was not to be discussed, not even in whispers. The last recorded trace of the project appears in 1947. In the deserts of New Mexico, multiple witnesses reported seeing individuals wearing silver medallions identical to those recovered in Springfield decades earlier. No official statement followed. No follow-up investigation is on record. And from that point on, Project Springfield simply ceased to exist, at least on paper. After 1947, there were no more official references to the stone. But the absence of records does not mean the absence of the story itself. In private collections and old family archives, strange artifacts began to surface. Silver medallions, faded photographs where the shadows looked unnatural, and letters bearing the same four-quartered circle. In 1965, a Boston collector purchased a small wooden casket at auction. It had been found in an abandoned house in Illinois. Inside lay a fragment of black stone, smooth to the touch, yet under certain light, faint symbols appeared across its surface. A week after acquiring it, the collector vanished without a trace. That same night, his house burned to the ground. The fragment was never recovered. In 1982, workers installing a new safe in the basement of a government building in Washington reported finding a hollow recess in the wall. At the bottom was a perfectly round impression, matching the stone's known dimensions. The niche was empty, but still warm, as if whatever had been there had been removed only moments before. In 2004, during White House renovations, contractors accidentally broke through a bricked-up passage. It led to a small, windowless room whose dimensions matched historic descriptions of room number 4. In the center of the floor was the same quartered circle symbol found on the medallions. Stonework specialists determined the floor markings were far too fresh to date back to the 19th century. Today, more than 160 years after the Night of the Four, the question remains open. The stone could be in private hands, locked in a government vault, or perhaps no longer on Earth at all. But if Lincoln's writings are to be believed, the stone is never alone. Perhaps that is why, in recent years, there's been a quiet uptick in unexplained incidents. Disappearances of people with no logical link to each other, sudden thermal surges recorded in otherwise empty locations, the reappearance of the symbol on the walls of historic buildings in Washington, D.C. And if the secret of the Four has truly survived into the present, the real question is not where the stone is, but who is keeping it now. By the end of the 19th century, few dared to speak aloud about the secret of the Four. The story that began in the basement of the White House in 1862 had dissolved into the layers of urban legend, whispered rumors that blurred into myth. But in March of 1896, an event in New York City tore the legend back into reality. On the Upper East Side of Manhattan, a man named Henry Morton Blake died quietly in his home on East 78th Street. He was a discreet, almost invisible figure in the city's legal circles, a private attorney, a man of means but with no public notoriety. Newspapers reported his death as the result of a sudden heart attack. But what drew real interest was the unusual detail in his last will and testament. Among the listed possessions was a single item, described in precise terms. A small mahogany box, which must be sold at a closed auction. No explanation was given for its significance. No appraisal of its worth was provided, just the instruction that it be auctioned, privately, to a list of hand-picked attendees. The auction took place a week later in the dim basement of the old Astoria Hotel. Only 7 people were present, all invited by personal letters, whose handwriting matched no known clerk or secretary. The mahogany box was lot number 4. It was sealed in dark red wax and bound with a chain. The rules of the sale were absolute. The box could not be opened until after purchase, and under no circumstances within the walls of the hotel. The bidding was brief but intense, conducted in almost complete silence, except for the clipped voice of the auctioneer. In the end, the winner was recorded simply as Mr. H. No surname, no address, only a single initial in the ledger. The hotel staff later spoke of a strange occurrence. When the box was carried out of the auction room, it left behind on the floor a perfectly defined imprint of a circle divided into 4 equal sectors. The mark was not burned, scratched, or painted. It simply existed on the wood, faint but impossible to ignore. Efforts to scrub it away failed. Even sanding the surface only made the symbol reappear, until the section of floor was removed entirely and replaced. 3 days after the auction, tragedy struck. One of the event's organizers, a man in his 40s, healthy and well-liked, was found dead in his locked apartment. On his chest lay a silver medallion engraved with the same 4-part circle. The door was bolted from the inside. The windows were latched. There were no signs of struggle, and yet his expression was one of profound fear, his eyes wide open, as if frozen in the moment of seeing something that should not be seen. Whispers began to circulate in Manhattan. They spoke of figures seen at night moving together in perfect synchronization. Always 4 of them, always in long black coats, their steps measured as though keeping time with an unheard rhythm. Some said they had seen the glint of silver medallions beneath their lapels. Others insisted these men and women were never the same faces twice, as if the identities behind the medallions shifted from one generation to the next. The name Circle Keepers began to surface in the city's darker conversations, those who carried on the legacy of Lincoln's hidden guardianship. It was not just an inheritance of an object, but of an obligation, passed in silence and bound by rules no outsider could fully understand. The trail from that auction would eventually lead to a mansion in the quieter, older streets of the city. Behind its locked doors, away from the noise of the Gilded Age, a peculiar project was undertaken: the construction of a perfect replica of room number 4 from the White House basement. The dimensions were exact. The placement of the doorway and even the texture of the brick were copied from the original, and in the center, a circular marking had been carved into the floor, ready, it seemed, for something that had not yet arrived, or something that had never truly left. In 1901, on the outskirts of Newark, New Jersey, construction began on a sprawling mansion for the Reinhardt family, German immigrants who had amassed a fortune in shipping and port logistics. The project was entrusted to architect Otto Vogel, a man known in certain circles not just for his opulent designs, but for his uncanny ability to weave hidden passages, cryptic symbols, and concealed chambers into the very bones of a building. Among the original blueprints preserved in the Newark City archives, one feature stands out. Deep in the basement, separate from the main cellar, Vogel had designed a perfectly round chamber, windowless, its walls lined entirely with copper panels. At the exact center stood a low cylindrical pedestal, its top a smooth, unbroken disc of metal. On the plans, this room carried a cryptic label: Archive Number 4. Publicly, the Reinhardts explained it away as a wine cellar. The copper, they said, meant to keep temperature stable. But the workers on site told a different story. They whispered about the engravings, strange, curling marks and intersecting lines etched into the copper panels. One laborer, a man named Harris Doyle, tried to copy the markings into a small notebook. A week later, Doyle disappeared. His pay was collected by a family member no one in the crew had met before. The notebook was never recovered. By early 1902, the mansion was complete. The Reinhardts hosted a private gathering to christen the new estate, not a society gala, but a selective event with fewer than a dozen guests. Among them, city records list a young businessman, Friedrich Trump. The official record describes the meeting blandly as a business discussion regarding shipping ventures. But the household's senior maid kept a diary, and in one brief, telling line she wrote, "The stern man lingered long in the lower chamber, his fingers resting on the medallion at his neck." Within a few years, the Reinhardt fortune began to unravel. A combination of failed shipments, port accidents, and inexplicable debts eroded their empire. By 1910, the family quietly sold the estate in what the county registrar later described as a non-standard transaction. The buyer listed simply as an unknown investor. That investor never appeared in person. The property was managed instead by Joseph Trump, a distant relative of Friedrich. His name surfaces in local tax filings, but almost nowhere else. From that point on, room number 4 became a place of ritualized secrecy. Only 3 people were ever known to enter. Joseph Trump himself, a tall man in a black coat, seen only once a year, and on rare occasions, discreet visitors from Europe, who stayed less than a day and always departed under cover of night. According to the account of a former groundskeeper who spoke decades later and insisted on anonymity, something changed in the winter of 1918. He claimed that a massive black stone was brought into the house under extraordinary precautions. The delivery took place after midnight in freezing rain. The object was swaddled in thick black cloth and carried by 4 men wearing gloves and silver medallions. The groundskeeper never saw the stone uncovered, but he swore he could feel a faint, steady pulse emanating from it. Not through the air, but through the soles of his boots, as though the very floor hummed beneath him. Those familiar with the older history recognized the description immediately. It matched, in every unsettling detail, the stone that had vanished decades earlier from the basements of the White House after the mysterious events of 1862. What was the purpose of bringing it to Newark, and why to a private mansion rather than a government facility? If the secret of the 4 had truly passed into the hands of the Trump family line, as some researchers later claimed, then room number 4 in the Reinhardt estate was more than a replica of the White House chamber. It was its successor, and somewhere in those copper-lined walls, the next chapter of the stone's journey began. In January of 1918, the cargo steamer Wilhelm Voss docked at the Newark waterfront after a transatlantic voyage from Hamburg. Its manifest was unremarkable. 7 shipping containers, mostly industrial machinery and spare parts, except for one anomaly. The 8th container did not appear on any customs record. It was small in size, but its listed weight was nearly a metric ton. The shipping manifest bore only a vague notation in German: private gut, private property. No description of contents, no declared owner. Witnesses at the docks later recalled the unusual handling of the crate. It was not placed with the other cargo for inspection, but instead lifted directly from the hold onto a waiting covered truck. 2 tall men supervised the process, both wearing long black coats, high-collared wool scarves, and military-style caps with no insignia. They spoke little, and when they did, it was in short, clipped phrases in German. The truck did not stop at any customs office. Instead, it rolled straight through the dim streets of Newark, past the warehouses, until it reached the high wrought-iron gates of the Reinhardt mansion. The driver never returned to the port. 2 days later, the deaths began. 3 dock workers who had helped unload the mysterious crate were found in their homes, all under eerily similar conditions. Each lay fully clothed, as if they had simply stopped mid-action and collapsed. Their skin was bloodless, carrying a bluish pallor. Their eyes were open wide, the pupils blown into dark discs. On the palms of each man's hands was a deep, almost branded mark, a circle divided into 4 equal sectors. The coroner could not explain the cause of death. There was no sign of struggle, no internal trauma, no poison detected. The official verdict was cardiac failure under unknown conditions. Privately, police officers on the case whispered that the marks on the hands were too perfect to be natural. Rumors spread quickly through the dockside taverns. Some swore the crate contained a black stone, one that felt cold to the touch, yet somehow burned from within. Others claimed it gave off a faint vibration, like the steady breathing of some buried animal. By early spring, the Reinhardt mansion had transformed into a place of rare but highly secretive gatherings. Expensive motor cars would arrive at odd hours, bringing small groups of unsmiling men who would vanish into the basement for hours at a time. Servants reported hearing a faint hum from below, not mechanical exactly, but deep and resonant, like the sound of a church organ heard through stone walls. The gatherings never lasted more than a night, and each time the guests left, they did so without speaking, stepping into the dark as if continuing a journey that had begun elsewhere. In the city's tax records for 1918, the mansion's ownership shifted. The new owner was listed as Trump Encumbered Holdings, with Joseph Trump's signature at the bottom of the transfer deed. No money changed hands in the sale. The property simply passed from the Reinhardts to the holding company. Only one surviving source, a brief column in a Newark newspaper, mentioned anything unusual about that night. It noted that a faint golden light was observed through the basement windows of the Reinhardt estate during the hour before midnight. The article was buried in the local section and forgotten within days. But for those who had followed the fragmented trail of the Secret of the Four, it was the first public hint that the Black Stone, lost since the days of Abraham Lincoln, had resurfaced. From that moment on, the true history of the mansion's basement and of room number 4 within it would belong to the Trump family. July 1918 brought a heat wave so fierce that the wrought iron railings along Newark's balconies scorched the skin at the slightest touch. Pavement shimmered in the haze, and the air above the harbor was heavy with the smell of salt and coal smoke. Yet in the basement of the Reinhardt mansion, the temperature never changed. It remained as cold as a glacier cellar, a steady, unnatural chill that no summer heat could penetrate. On the night of July 14th, 4 men descended into room number 4. Their identities would never appear in a single official document together, but scattered sources allow us to name them. Joseph Trump, the mansion's new owner and controller of Trump Encumbered Holdings. A tall, silent figure in a black cloak, face shadowed beneath the brim of a wide felt hat. A silver-haired Boston attorney known for his dealings in discreet inheritances. Thomas Reynolds, a young and ambitious banker with a reputation for taking risks. The circular chamber was lit only by 2 shielded oil lamps, their light glinting off the polished copper panels lining the walls. In the exact center of the room stood the low copper pedestal, and upon it, the stone. It was black, without a single fracture, its surface so smooth and reflective that it seemed to swallow the light. At times, it appeared to ripple faintly, as if the solid mass were, in fact, liquid just beneath its skin. No first-hand witness accounts survive. The servants were dismissed from the mansion that evening. But in the city police archives, there is a single report from a patrol officer on night watch. He noted an unnatural glow visible through the half-basement windows of the Reinhardt estate. The color, he wrote, was a warm golden hue that nonetheless carried the feeling of cold. By dawn, only 3 of the 4 men emerged onto the veranda of the mansion. Each wore around his neck an identical silver medallion engraved with the symbol of a circle divided into 4 equal sectors. Thomas Reynolds was gone. No announcement of his departure was made. The bank he worked for reported him on extended leave, but within months his office was emptied and his personal records erased. Local rumor, whispered only in the back rooms of Newark's older taverns, claimed that Reynolds had become part of the stone, not figuratively, literally. According to the legend, after that night, the artifact's surface bore a faint distortion, the blurred outline of a human face, features stretched as if beneath deep, dark water. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood around the mansion changed. Clocks in nearby houses would sometimes stop exactly at 4 a.m., their pendulums frozen for 1 minute before starting again on their own. House pets, dogs and cats alike, refused to walk along the street leading to the Reinhardt gates, sometimes bolting into traffic rather than pass the property. Researchers studying the fragmentary accounts believe the stone had been activated that night. The presence of 4 medallion bearers, the circle, was required for it to function. And once the circle was complete, the artifact would not rest. But by the autumn of 1918, its cost became clear. One of the remaining 3, the Boston attorney, died under circumstances so bizarre that the coroner's report was sealed by court order. Within a week, his medallion was passed to a replacement, a man whose last name would, in decades to come, be directly tied to the highest tiers of American political power. The circle endured, and the stone remained in room number 4, waiting for whatever would come next, October 1918. The second wave of the Spanish flu swept through Newark like a dark tide. The papers printed grim columns about overflowing hospitals, coffins stacked in church basements, and funeral processions that wound for blocks. But one death went entirely unmentioned in the press, the passing of the silver-haired Boston attorney, one of the 4 who guarded the stone. The official cause: complications from influenza. But according to 2 physicians who took part in the autopsy, and later spoke anonymously, the man showed no sign of the virus. Instead, they found something else. His heart had contracted into a hard knot, the muscle tissue transformed into a dense, stone-like deposit. The fibers of his arms and neck had the same texture, brittle and mineralized. And his eyes, the pupils had turned a metallic gold. Around his neck hung the medallion of the 4. On the reverse, freshly engraved, were the words, "He is gone, but the circle lives." Within a week, the vacant place in the circle was filled. The choice fell to Frederick Trump, a distant relative of Joseph Trump, already making his name in the real estate and hotel trade. By all public accounts, Frederick's arrival in Newark was routine, a businessman visiting family, perhaps exploring investment opportunities. But the mansion's housekeeper, whose private diary surfaced decades later, wrote something else. He went down into the copper room after sundown. The stone, it changed. It was black before, but in his presence it deepened, darker than any shadow, and yet it held a glow inside, like embers beneath glass. From that day forward, the basement of the Reinhardt mansion became a place of steady, discreet arrivals. Heavy wooden crates were carried down the steps by men who spoke no English, unloaded from wagons that came not just from the docks of New York, but from ships arriving from Europe, Asia, and even the coasts of Africa. On the city's import records, these deliveries were labeled construction materials. But the stevedores who moved them swore they contained flat stone slabs, each engraved with a single sector of the 4-part circle. Some slabs were black like the original stone, others were pale, almost white, but seemed to hum faintly when lifted. Frederick's takeover of the circle shifted its focus, while the Trump family's public ventures flourished, expanding hotel chains, buying up parcels of land along the eastern seaboard. The inner circle met in room number 4 for one purpose only: to study the stone, test its reactions, and hunt for its missing fragments. There were whispers in the harbor bars that the Trumps were assembling something, though no one could say what. Theories ranged from an elaborate vault to a machine of unknown design. But within the mansion walls, the reality was far stranger. Every time a new slab was brought into room number 4, the main stone responded. The black surface rippled, its glow pulsing in slow, deliberate rhythms. Sometimes the copper walls themselves grew cold enough to frost over, even in the heart of summer. By early 1919, all 4 members of the circle, Joseph Trump, Frederick Trump, the man in the black cloak, and the unseen 4th, were meeting more frequently. and according to an unsigned letter found in a Newark police evidence box decades later, one of those meetings ended with a sound that wasn't thunder and not a voice, but something in between, speaking from inside the stone. The circle was no longer simply guarding the artifact. They were awakening it. January 1919. The winter in Newark was sharp and wind-burned, with ice crusting along the gutters of the Reinhardt mansion. On the morning of the 12th, a single unmarked truck rolled up to the gated drive. The manifest listed the sender as Archival Department, Washington, D.C. But when local clerks later checked the municipal ledgers, they found no record of any such department, nor of any outbound shipment to New Jersey that month. The crate itself was plain, reinforced with iron bands, but scorched into the lid, deep and deliberate, was a date: 1862. When the nails were drawn and the lid pried away, those present saw a sealed metal container, its edges soldered shut. Across the lid was an engraving, the four-quartered circle. Beneath it, in precise serif letters, the words, "Everything begins and everything ends here." The container was carried, under guard, into room number 4. The moment it crossed the threshold, the black stone at the room's center began to tremble, not violently, but with a slow, steady pulse, as if it were breathing. Witnesses later swore the change was immediate. The copper walls radiated a biting cold, yet the air itself grew warmer, heavy with the smell of old paper and faint ash. The electric bulbs overhead dimmed to an amber glow. Shadows drew longer, bending oddly on the curved walls. Joseph Trump gave the order. "Open it, now." Inside, under layers of yellowed linen, lay a rolled parchment tied with black cord. The script upon it was unmistakable, deliberate, formal strokes. At the top, in clear ink, A. Lincoln. The message was brief, only a handful of lines. The four must remember. If the circle is broken, the stone will return all to the beginning. Those who touch it will become part of it. Beneath Lincoln's name were 4 fingerprints, each pressed into the ink within its own quarter of the circle. 3 prints were faded with age. The 4th was sharp, recent, fresh enough that the ridges still gleamed in the lamplight. That night, Newark went dark. At precisely 8:47 p.m., every electric light in the city failed. The blackout lasted exactly 47 minutes. During that span, a handful of residents on the far side of the Passaic River reported seeing a dim golden glow hovering above the Reinhardt mansion. One described it as the light of a lantern under deep water. When the power returned, the circle convened again in room number 4. In the family's private ledgers, a new phrase began to appear beside their coded financial entries. "We are the second 4." With the phrase came a shift in their behavior. From that winter onward, all 4 members were required to be present in the room whenever the stone was uncovered. It was not superstition. The stone demanded it. Any absence was met with immediate consequences. One member collapsed into convulsions after being delayed by a train. Another suffered a sudden, violent nosebleed that left the copper floor spattered. The most unnerving incident came in March, when the man in the black cloak failed to arrive on time. The remaining 3 experienced simultaneous blackouts. Witnesses later found them standing around the stone in total silence, eyes open but unfocused, each with thin streams of blood running from the tear ducts. The parchment from Washington, Lincoln's parchment, had done more than bridge a gap between eras. It had fixed the rules. The circle could no longer be broken without consequence. The stone could not be destroyed. And when the time came, it would not be surrendered. It would be passed. The family archives would never again refer to it simply as the stone. From 1919 onward, it was written in cipher as The Inheritance, Spring, 1919. For the first time since the black stone had been in their possession, the Trump family decided to use it not as guardians, but as owners. Their goal was precise: to focus the stone's influence on a single outcome, an upcoming shipping contract in the port of New York. If secured, it would grant them a near-total monopoly on a supply chain from Europe. The plan required all 4. At exactly midnight, the circle assembled in room number 4. Lincoln's parchment was unrolled on the copper pedestal. The black stone sat in the center, surrounded by the 4 silver medallions, each aligned to its quarter of the engraved circle. When all 4 placed their hands upon the stone, the air changed instantly. Silence fell so deep that even the sound of their own breathing vanished. One of them later wrote that it was as if my blood had stopped moving. Then, without a sound, fine hairline fractures began to appear in the copper walls, glowing with a strange light, gold, but veined with black, like molten metal churning under the surface. The stone grew warmer, and an unmistakable metallic taste coated their tongues. That same night, without warning, a storm rose over Newark and the lower reaches of New York Harbor. But it was no rainstorm. The sky blackened as though under eclipse, yet no clouds moved. For 7 days, daylight was dulled, shadows stretched unnaturally, and the air hummed faintly in the stillness. Electrical grids began to fail, street lamps flickered, mechanical clocks stopped at random hours, then restarted without being wound. Compasses spun aimlessly. And in those same 7 days, every major rival to the Trump shipping interests suffered disaster. One warehouse burned in the night, leaving only a circle of unscorched floorboards at its center. A second rival watched a fully loaded vessel vanish from the harbor, last seen drifting under clear skies before disappearing behind a veil of unnatural fog. Another competitor's flagship was found abandoned at anchor, engines cold, crew gone, no sign of struggle. By the end of the 7th day, there was no opposition left. The contract was signed without contest. The stone had done exactly what they asked. But success came with a price. On the 8th day, Joseph Trump awoke to find every hair on his head turned snow white overnight. His hands shook uncontrollably, the tremor never leaving him for the rest of his life. He began hearing whispers at night, faint, persistent, always coming from the direction of room number 4. The whispers spoke in a language he did not know, yet he understood the intent. You are not in control. Around the city, rumors spread. Neighbors told stories of a curse tied to an old mansion on the outskirts. Shopkeepers claimed that animals refused to cross the street leading to the estate. A few spoke of the storm, as if it had been alive, searching for something. There was no proof. No witness could link the strange events to the Trumps. And yet, Newark wasn't the same city once the storm passed. The air felt heavier. The nights seemed longer. And for those who lived near the Reinhardt mansion, the faint hum beneath the ground never entirely went away. From that spring forward, the 4 understood a truth Lincoln had left unwritten. The stone did not serve them. It allowed them to borrow its power, and it always collected payment. After the events of the 7 days of darkness, it became clear that Joseph Trump could no longer serve as one of the 4. His health deteriorated with frightening speed. He struggled to hold even the lightest objects, fumbled with his own signature, and began failing to recognize certain relatives. By winter, he spoke less of business and more of faces in the stone, watching him, following him into his dreams, whispering without sound. The family faced a dangerous dilemma: replace him, risking the rupture of the circle, or attempt to seal the stone temporarily. The second option was dismissed immediately. Lincoln's parchment had been explicit. If the circle is broken, the stone will return everything to the beginning. No one in the Trump household was willing to test what the beginning meant. In the end, the stone seemed to make the decision itself. In March 1920, during a late-night meeting in room number 4, the copper-lined walls hummed faintly as the 4 stood around the pedestal. Without warning, the door opened. No knock, no challenge from the guards above. A man entered, unannounced. His name was Arthur Crane, a young attorney who had occasionally represented the family in minor land disputes. There was nothing about him to suggest he should have been there. He had not been invited. And yet he moved through the mansion unhindered, as though every lock had already been turned for him. When Crane stepped up to the pedestal, Joseph Trump's medallion slipped from his neck without a hand touching it, landing at Crane's feet with the soft sound of falling metal. The black stone surface shifted under the lamplight, warming to the touch, and 4 thin new scratches appeared along its facets, aligning perfectly into the engraved circle of 4 sectors. From that moment forward, Arthur Crane became part of the circle. No official record ever tied his name to the stone, but within the mansion there was no question. He was unmarried, without children, and carried a reputation murky enough that few in the legal community trusted him, an ideal figure for handling matters that could never be written down. But Crane's arrival also marked a change in the stone's behavior. Within weeks, unusual coincidences began to ripple through the city. Court cases where Crane appeared, no matter how hopeless, ended in his client's favor. Judges known for their stubborn impartiality suddenly issued rulings with barely a word of justification. Opponents of his clients suffered strange misfortunes: a sudden illness, a warehouse fire, a missing ledger at a crucial moment. Witnesses claimed that when Crane entered a courtroom, he carried no notes, yet spoke as if he already knew every counterargument. Some swore his voice seemed to echo strangely against walls that should have been acoustically dead. For the first time, the Trumps realized the stone could influence events directly, without their explicit command. It no longer waited for ritual or unanimous intent. The circle's will was being supplemented, or overridden, by something else entirely. This frightened them more than they admitted to one another, because if the stone could act without their instruction, then it could choose whom to favor and whom to destroy. And there was another detail no one outside the mansion ever knew. The night Crane joined the circle, Joseph Trump's condition worsened. By dawn, he no longer recognized his own name. Within a month, he had been moved out of the mansion entirely, placed in a private clinic on the coast. The medallion he had worn for years never returned to his possession. When the staff of room number 4 cleaned the copper floor after that night, they found something new: 4 faint footprints surrounding the pedestal. 3 were familiar. The 4th was bare, as if made by someone standing there without shoes. The guards on duty swore that Crane had been wearing polished leather boots when he entered. In the summer of 1921, Newark was gripped by a wave of mysterious fires. Several old warehouses along the railroad tracks went up in flames within weeks of each other. Official reports blamed faulty wiring or careless workers, but in private conversations, the fire brigade admitted there was something unusual about the way the blazes spread, swiftly, as if driven by an unseen wind. One of the warehouses belonged to a shell company quietly controlled by the Trump family. It was used for storing shipments that arrived under false manifests and were later transported, discreetly and at night, to the Reinhardt mansion. On the night of July 17th, the fire reached the mansion itself. The official record claimed a kitchen electrical fault, but the first firefighters on the scene told a different story. The flames weren't coming from above. They were rising from the basement. When the 4 descended into room number 4, they found the black stone off its pedestal, resting in the far corner as though it had been pushed or had moved on its own. The copper wall panels were glowing white-hot, radiating a heat so intense that stepping near them blistered skin in seconds. Deep cracks had split the floor, all radiating outward from the pedestal toward the door. It looked less like damage from fire and more like the aftermath of an impact, as if the artifact had tried to force its way out. The Lincoln Scroll, normally kept sealed in a protective case beside the pedestal, had been found unrolled, lying open on the line. If it leaves of its own will, the circle shall be broken. The fire in the mansion was extinguished before it could spread, but the morning brought a more unsettling discovery. In the far corner of the basement, half hidden beneath collapsed shelving, was a metal case, identical in shape and dimensions to the stone itself. The fit was so precise that it could only have been crafted for that singular purpose. But the case was empty. On its lid, etched in deep, precise grooves, was a single date: 1862. The same date burned into the wooden crate that had once delivered the Lincoln Scroll. The metal was cool to the touch, despite the inferno only hours earlier. Servants whispered that in the hours before the fire, the house had been filled with a deep, resonant hum, like a distant cathedral bell, struck again and again in slow intervals. And outside, rolling through the gardens and across the street, had been a thick, gold-tinted fog that muffled sound and made lamps appear dim. The circle knew that keeping the stone in the mansion was now too dangerous. The cracks in the copper-lined chamber were a warning. Whatever had happened during the fire, The stone had acted without them. If it could move, it could leave. That very night, the four met in secret and agreed on a desperate measure. The artifact would be relocated under heavier guard to a place where no one, not even their own household staff, would know its exact position. But the relocation would not go unnoticed. As the stone made its way east toward New York City, under the cover of darkness, its presence drew attention, the kind of attention the Circle had managed to avoid for decades. In the city, there were already people watching the Trump network quietly, men whose own family histories, like the Trumps, were bound up in strange disappearances, coded documents, and sealed rooms. People whose descendants, nearly a century later, would walk the highest halls of American political power. The first sighting came from a dock worker in Hoboken, who claimed to have seen a sealed crate lifted from a covered truck onto a private boat bound for Manhattan. The crate, he said, seemed heavier than it should have been, as though it didn't want to be moved. He recalled one more detail. When the crate shifted in the sling, it gave off a sound, not wood scraping against wood, but a low, throbbing pulse, like a heartbeat too slow to be human. The Circle had wanted to hide the stone. Instead, they had announced its existence to a new set of eyes that would not forget what they had seen. After the fire and the stone's apparent attempt to leave its chamber, the Circle understood one thing with absolute clarity. Remaining in Newark was no longer an option. The authorities had begun asking too many questions about the blaze, and the strange rumors of a mansion wrapped in golden fog were spreading through the city faster than the Circle could suppress them. By early September 1921, a decision was made. The stone would be moved, far from the Reinhardt estate, to a place where its presence could be hidden in plain sight. It was sealed inside the same metallic case, the one etched with the date 1862, and in the dead of night was loaded onto a covered truck. The route into New York was deliberately chaotic. The convoy changed vehicles multiple times, stopping at unmarked warehouses and back alley loading docks. Each transfer was designed to mislead any potential watchers, scattering the trail until no single driver knew the entire path the stone had taken. The final stop was an unassuming warehouse in Queens, recently purchased and registered under Trump and Cumber Holdings. On the outside, it looked like any other brick storage building, but deep inside, a perfect replica of room number 4 had been built. Walls lined with copper panels, a circular pedestal positioned exactly in the center, temperature control systems humming quietly in the corners. This time, the chamber was reinforced with a steel frame hidden behind the copper, an extra skin meant to contain or restrain. The entrance was guarded by a massive mechanical vault door, its combination known only to the four. Even the men who installed it were told the chamber was nothing more than a wine cellar for sensitive European imports. Unofficial accounts from the period mention one other figure present on the night the stone was installed in its new chamber. He was described as tall, with sharp, angular features, and an unsettling stillness in his posture. In internal paperwork, his name appeared only once: Donald. His role at that time was unclear, but decades later, this same name would surface again, woven tightly into the history of the family dynasty. Once the stone was in place, the Circle noticed something they had never seen before. The artifact stopped calling for them. The almost instinctive pull to gather, the pressure that had forced them to meet regularly in Newark, was gone. Its surface, once warm to the touch, turned cold again. The faint golden shimmer that had sometimes played across its black skin vanished completely. It was as if the stone had gone dormant. Some within the Circle feared this silence, interpreting it as the calm before a greater storm. Others saw it as a blessing, proof that relocating the stone had severed whatever connection tied it to the old chamber. But none of them could shake the feeling that this wasn't the end, only an intermission. For the next 18 years, the stone sat in its fortified chamber beneath Queens, untouched except for the periodic inspections carried out by the four. No hum, no light, no heat. It was an object without presence, until one looked too long at its surface and felt the faintest shift, like the shadow of movement beneath still water. Outside, the world changed. The Great Depression rose and fell. New York grew upward in steel and glass. The Trump family quietly expanded their influence in construction and hospitality, funding ventures others wouldn't touch. And through it all, the chamber in Queens remained sealed, waiting. The Circle would later come to believe the stone had been watching during those 2 decades, observing, measuring, choosing its moment. That moment would come in the early 1940s, when a convergence of war, politics, and something far older would wake it again. The sleep of the stone was only the longest breath before the next chapter in what history would one day call the Trump dynasty. In 1921, in the very heart of New York City, the first stone was laid for a building that, in time, would become a symbol not just of wealth and influence, but of something far older and far more unsettling. On the official photographs of the opening ceremony for the Trump Dominion building, a single figure draws the eye, a tall man in a perfectly tailored suit, his posture rigid, his expression fixed and unreadable. His face shows no warmth, no tension, no hint of uncertainty. This was Edward Trump, a businessman of German origin who, according to the public record, had arrived in the United States only a year before the outbreak of the First World War. Newspapers at the time painted the Trump family's story as a model immigrant success. Years of relentless labor, gradual accumulation of wealth, and calculated investments in real estate. Yet one detail never fit. No photographs of Edward Trump prior to 1921 have ever been found. No documents of his supposed earlier life in America have surfaced. No addresses, no business licenses, no mention in shipping manifests. It is as if he simply appeared in New York, already in possession of millions of dollars and a network of contacts powerful enough to secure him prime land in Manhattan. The Dominion building was presented to the public as the headquarters of the East Coast Road Improvement Association, a little-known organization whose stated mission was to promote the development of transportation infrastructure. The reality, however, was far stranger. Beneath the marble floors and gilded lobbies, in the echoing cellars that stretched under the streets, private gatherings took place, always at night, always behind locked doors, always guarded by men who spoke to no one. A surviving statement from a chance observer, archived in a neglected corner of the municipal records office, offers one of the only eyewitness accounts of such an evening. All the windows of the building had been sealed with heavy curtains, so no light could escape. I saw men wearing black gloves carry long, narrow crates into the main hall. A strange odor hung in the air, something between heated metal and church incense. Later, when the doors opened again, I noticed something peculiar. Fewer people left the building than had gone inside. Over the next 4 years, Edward Trump acquired entire city blocks. Yet, curiously, he rarely rebuilt or renovated the structures he purchased. Instead, he seemed far more interested in what lay beneath them. Basements of century-old townhouses, sealed-off sublevels of derelict warehouses, forgotten storage vaults from the colonial era. Time and again, his acquisitions revealed buried tunnels and abandoned chambers. Some connected to points marked on antique maps of New York, places that no longer existed above ground. By 1925, whispers began to circulate in the city's upper circles. Trump, they said, was linked to a clandestine order known as the Circle of the Eastern Gate, a brotherhood whose lineage traced back deep into the shadows of European history. Their emblem was simple yet unsettling, a triangle inscribed within a perfect circle, accompanied by 3 Latin words: ingressum, custodium, exodus, entrance, guardianship, exit. What they guarded, no one could say for certain. Some spoke of artifacts recovered from old cathedrals in the German states, others of relics brought across the Atlantic centuries earlier and hidden beneath the city's foundations. But those few who claimed to have glimpsed the subterranean halls of the Dominion building spoke of something entirely different. The walls, they said, were etched from floor to ceiling with symbols that resembled no known alphabet, lines and spirals that seemed to shift in the corner of one's vision, forms that suggested both writing and architecture, as if the very language had been designed to be built, not read. One witness claimed the markings were not carved into the stone, but pressed from within, as though the building itself had been formed around them. No one ever photographed these walls. No sketch survives. And yet the rumors persisted, whispered from one decade to the next, that the Dominion building's true purpose had nothing to do with roads or offices, and everything to do with what waited in the dark beneath New York's streets. In the spring of 1932, only a few weeks after the funeral of Edward Trump, a crew of laborers descended into the basement of the Trump Dominion building. Their instructions were straightforward: dismantle the old archival shelving, reinforce the foundation, and prepare the lower floors for minor renovation. But the job changed the moment one of them tapped a wall with his hammer and heard something hollow. Behind a sheet of poured concrete, old, rough, and clearly added after the building's original construction, was a sealed chamber. The opening was narrow, forcing the men to squeeze through into a space that felt noticeably colder than the rest of the basement. The room was small, windowless, and bare. The only light came from a single bulb dangling from the ceiling, its cord vanishing into a cable that did not appear to connect to any of the city's electrical grids. No switch, no fuse box, just a slow, constant glow. In the center of the floor stood a massive wooden chest, dark with age. It was sealed with a mechanical lock. No keyhole, no combination numbers, only a single rotating disc engraved with symbols unlike any alphabet the men recognized. They weren't Latin, they weren't Cyrillic. They seemed almost pictorial, yet carried a strange internal symmetry. The foreman radioed upstairs for instructions, but the reply never came. Instead of waiting, the crew set to work with crowbars, forcing the lock. The wood resisted more than it should have, fibers snapping reluctantly, as if they had been grown to hold something in, not just to enclose it. When the lid finally gave way, the air in the room shifted. A sharp, layered smell rushed out, a mixture of damp earth, old ash, and something harder to name, something metallic but burned. Inside was an object, no larger than a suitcase, yet unlike anything the workers had ever seen. It looked like a block of black resin, but its geometry betrayed its artificial nature. Edges too exact, surfaces unnaturally smooth. Even in the warmth of the basement, it was cold to the touch. Its surface reflected no light, swallowing it instead. The find was removed under orders from above and taken not to a city department, but to a private laboratory long known to have discreet ties with the Trump family. The official records of any testing vanish here. Nothing in the municipal archives, no reference in the newspapers. But a carbon copy of a letter survives in the personal papers of a city clerk, dated June 1932. It reads, "Material, unknown origin. Not subject to cutting, melting, or deformation. When exposed to light at a precise wavelength, surface reveals a set of lines resembling a coastal outline, not of any current map." 3 days later, the man who had written that letter vanished. He left behind no personal effects, no sign of struggle, just an office with the blinds drawn and a cold cup of coffee on his desk. That same day, the chamber in the basement of the Dominion building was filled with concrete. The order was carried out immediately, and the explanation given was risk of structural collapse. All access was sealed, and the plans for that part of the building were quietly redrawn to erase its existence. Publicly, the Trump family denied that anything unusual had been found. Yet, among the city's storage invoices from that year, there remains one curious line item: a wooden crate, marked as defective industrial sample, removed from the Dominion building and transferred to an undisclosed location. The signature on the receipt is unmistakable: Frederick Trump, Edward's son, then just beginning to take the reins of the family's growing empire. From that point onward, the Trumps were no longer spoken of simply as a wealthy dynasty. Whispers began to call them keepers, custodians of something that was never meant to be discovered, something that could not be destroyed, and something that no outsider should ever be allowed to possess. In the autumn of 1937, the industrial quarter of Brooklyn lit up in a way it had not in decades. A fire broke out in warehouse number 12, a sprawling, brick-walled structure owned by Trump Storage and Logistics. City papers would later call it the strangest blaze of the decade, not for its destruction, but for the way it behaved. The warehouse stood near the waterfront, in a district of cranes, cobblestones, and rail spurs. It was a gray, wet afternoon. rain falling in steady sheets. Under normal circumstances, that rain should have slowed any fire before it could take hold. Instead, the flames inside number 12 erupted with a sudden, violent bloom, as if they had been waiting. Within minutes, smoke poured from every upper window. Fire crews arrived quickly and began forcing entry. According to their official statements, the building contained rolls of fabric, stacked lumber, and archived records. Nothing unusual for a company whose public business was storage and freight. But the first men through the side entrance saw something else. Neat rows of metal containers, each waist-high, each stenciled with a series of unfamiliar symbols. The markings were not numbers, not letters, at least not from any alphabet recognized by the men on scene. But they matched something seen before. The same strange characters that had been engraved on the lock of the wooden chest discovered in the basement of the Trump Dominion building 5 years earlier. And the fire itself did not behave like fire should. Witnesses described it as moving deliberately, ignoring the push of the wind, advancing in long, perfect lines, as though tracing some invisible pattern across the warehouse floor. Entire piles of timber ignited at once, while other areas, mere feet away, remained untouched. Several firefighters, in later private conversations, claimed they heard a sound under the roar of the flames, a deep, resonant hum, slow and rhythmic, almost like chanting. None of these details made it into the official incident report. The captain on duty that day would later tell his son, "We were told to forget what we heard." When the blaze was finally beaten back, little remained of the structure but its charred steel skeleton. And yet, among the wreckage, some of the metal containers stood pristine. No scorch marks, no warping from the heat. When the men touched them, their walls felt cold. Inside, each box held a single object, wrapped in thick, pale cloth. The fabric had a faint sheen, almost waxy to the touch, and though it had been surrounded by intense fire, it showed no signs of burning or melting. It seemed to repel heat entirely. The city never cataloged these items. The paperwork trail ends abruptly with a terse note in the fire department's file. Contents transferred for disposal under private order. That order came directly from Frederick Trump. No description of the objects, no mention of where they were sent. Years later, however, a small piece of that same cloth surfaced in the private collection of a Manhattan antiquarian. He claimed to have bought it from a retired dock worker who had been paid to keep quiet after the fire. Laboratory analysis revealed the material was composed of roughly 70% organic matter, but of a kind that did not match any known plant or animal tissue. The rest was an unidentifiable compound that resisted both chemical and thermal breakdown. After the fire, the Trump family altered their operations. Every property they owned acquired new layers of security: private guards, reinforced access points, cameras in the stairwells. The basement of the Trump Dominion building was sealed again, this time behind a heavy steel grille secured with 7 separate locks. Among New York's business elite, the whispers began to shift. The Trumps were no longer spoken of merely as real estate magnates. The language changed: custodians, keepers, carriers. It was said they moved and protected objects whose origins lay far beyond any trade ledger or shipping manifest. Objects that, if lost or exposed, might draw the wrong kind of attention not from rival companies, but from things no one wanted to meet. In 1944, as battles raged across Europe and the Pacific, the United States Department of Defense signed an unusual wartime contract with the Trump family. On paper, it was routine, filed under logistical support for strategic material transport. But documents declassified decades later revealed glaring irregularities. The contract contained no clear descriptions of the cargo, no specific routes, no recorded tonnage or delivery schedules. Instead, it included a clause, buried halfway through the text, that prohibited any mention of the project in official reports, in newspapers, or even in private correspondence. Violation would bring criminal prosecution under wartime statutes. What little is known suggests that under this arrangement, Trump Storage and Logistics acquired several aging cargo ships and exclusive access to designated rail spurs, connecting to isolated warehouses in New York, Pennsylvania, and New Mexico. One of those warehouses sat just a few miles from the Roswell Army Airfield. Yes, that Roswell, the name that would ignite global speculation only 3 years later. A former railroad employee, who decades later agreed to speak anonymously, recalled that during night runs to these warehouses, he saw flatbed cars loaded with long, lead-sealed crates, each roughly the size and shape of a coffin. The cars would arrive under full military guard. Soldiers, armed and silent, stood in a ring around the unloading area. The crates bore a now familiar marking, the same line of strange symbols stenciled on the fireproof containers, salvaged from the Brooklyn warehouse fire of 1937. More troubling still was what happened after the war. When the contract quietly ended, every ship used in the operation was dismantled and scrapped. The rail spurs were pulled up and sold for scrap metal. The warehouses, those that hadn't been outright demolished, were filled in with concrete, leaving only flat, empty pads in the weeds. Locals whispered that the ground in those places was wrong. Geiger counter hobbyists claimed the soil produced faint but measurable radiation. Others said compasses misbehaved there, as though an invisible field still lingered under the concrete. Then, in 1946, Frederick Trump abruptly stepped down as head of the company and withdrew from public life. The official explanation: health problems. The unofficial one: an irreconcilable dispute with federal agents over hazardous recoveries the Trumps had allegedly tried to keep for themselves. Whatever the truth, the family moved swiftly to erase this chapter from its history. There were no public records of the shipments, no surviving manifests, no invoices. The Navy's archive listed the Trump cargo vessels simply as expended assets. And yet, within the closed, whispered circles of New York's financial elite, a new rumor began to take root. The story went that the Trumps had struck a private bargain with the government. In exchange for their cooperation and silence, they were allowed to retain part of the shipment. If true, it would mean the family was not merely storing unknown materials. They were keeping them in the same kind of sealed, symbol-marked containers that had appeared again and again over the decades, always in places touched by secrecy, destruction, or disappearance. The question that has never been answered, not in official records, not in any surviving memoir, is simple. What was in those crates? And why was someone willing to risk everything to make sure at least a portion of it stayed in the hands of the Trump family? In the summer of 1953, during renovations on one of the older warehouses owned by Trump Storage and Logistics on Manhattan's West Side, a construction crew uncovered something that should not have been there. While tearing out a section of the north wall, they struck concrete that didn't match the building's original blueprints. It was thicker, far thicker, than anything else in the structure, nearly half a meter deep. The foreman assumed it was part of an old reinforcement pour, a wartime precaution. But when their hammers rang against it, the sound was wrong, muted, heavy, as if striking against a hollow core. Behind that wall was a windowless room, no larger than 3 meters square. No ventilation shafts, no wiring, no signs it had ever been connected to the rest of the building. Its single door had been sealed from the inside, the seams fused over in concrete so dense it had to be shattered piece by piece. When they finally broke through, the air that escaped was thick with dry, ancient dust, and something else. An almost imperceptible metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat. In the center of the room sat a massive wooden crate, its lid locked down by dozens of rusted bolts. The edges had been sealed with a hard, black resin, still intact after decades. On one side, burned deep into the grain, was a set of symbols, familiar now to historians of the Trump archives, identical to those seen on the wartime containers from the Brooklyn warehouse fire in 1937. But here, the markings weren't paint. They had been scorched into the wood, as though by a branding iron, impossible to remove without destroying the crate itself. When the bolts were finally worked loose, the men inside found a cylindrical metal vessel just over a meter in length. It was completely sealed, with no visible seams or latches. Beneath its dust-covered surface were irregular patches of corrosion, yet not the kind caused by water or salt. This looked as though the metal had been eaten away by something unknown, some chemical process that should not exist outside a laboratory, if at all. The laborers had no idea what they'd found. They reported it to their foreman, who passed it up to the site manager. 2 hours later, the warehouse was surrounded, not by police or uniformed soldiers, but by men in civilian clothes, carrying identification from an agency none of the workers had heard of before. The State Committee for Security. The crew was ordered out immediately. Each man signed a non-disclosure agreement under threat of prosecution, then was escorted off the premises. None of them ever worked for the company again. From that point, the trail of the container goes dark. There is no mention of it in the 1953 renovation reports, no photographs, no inventory records. But a few weeks later, multiple witnesses claimed they saw Frederick Trump himself standing outside the warehouse with 2 men in long, dark coats. One swore under oath that he saw the cylindrical object, wrapped in a canvas shroud, being loaded into an unmarked armored truck. What happened next is speculation. Some believe the container was transported to one of the family's off-record storage sites in Pennsylvania or New Mexico. Others think it never left New York, but was hidden in one of the company's private vaults beneath the city. What is documented is this. Beginning in late 1953, the Trump family's influence in New York's financial circles began to climb sharply. They invested in properties that made no immediate commercial sense. Empty lots, derelict brownstones, half-finished office towers, but which, years later, became critical pieces in the city's infrastructure. They seemed to be working to a long-term plan that no outsider could see. As for the container, no one can say what it held. The only surviving rumor, whispered years later by a former company accountant, was that it wasn't opened until several years after it was found. And when it was, it supposedly became the start of a private family legend, something passed down only to the next generation. The name given to it, according to that same source, was simple: the inheritance that cannot be sold. 1961. Donald Trump was only 15 years old, still more boy than man, when he first began to understand the long, cold shadow cast over his family. It was a summer afternoon, thick with the hum of Manhattan heat, when he crept up into the dusty attic of one of his father's older properties, a brick-faced townhouse the family rarely visited. The air smelled of mothballs and stale wood. Pushed into a far corner, beneath a faded tarpaulin, was a massive oak chest. The lock was rusted through, but the heavy iron crossbar still held the lid shut. It took Donald nearly an hour with a crowbar to pry them loose. Inside was not the clutter of forgotten furniture or clothes he expected, but a neatly stacked archive, a bundle of yellowed documents, a cracked leather notebook, and several black and white photographs. One photo showed a small, windowless cement room, the kind described in hushed family conversations, but never acknowledged in public. Another depicted a metal cylinder, the same proportions as the wartime containers, standing in the center of a richly furnished office. Around it, several men in dark suits stood with their hands behind their backs, their faces turned away from the camera. The notebook was the real prize. Its leather cover was split from age, the paper inside brittle to the touch, and every page carried a faint scent of scorched metal, as though it had been stored near something that had burned without flame. On the first page, written in Frederick Trump's precise hand, was a single line: "Keep it until they come, and do not open it if you want the world to remain as it is." From there, the writing grew stranger. Frederick described an encounter in the late 1920s with a man calling himself Dr. Carl Werner. Werner claimed to have returned from a secret Arctic expedition with an object not made by human hands. He was looking for someone wealthy, well-connected, and sufficiently cold-blooded to hide it away. Frederick had agreed, not realizing the decision would haunt the family for decades. The notebook contained what appeared to be a detailed description of the container's contents, but just as the account reached specifics, the page had been torn out. Only fragments of phrases remained. A voice that does not sound. Movement inside stillness. A light you cannot look at. Further entries leapt ahead to 1953, the year the sealed basement room had been discovered. Frederick wrote that the object had begun, affecting those in its proximity, causing vivid nightmares and lapses in memory. 3 workers involved in moving the container soon disappeared. Officially, they were let go and left the city, but neighbors swore none of them ever came home. Near the middle of the notebook, sketches began to replace sentences, symbols, sigils, geometric diagrams. One stood out, a circle divided into 4 equal quadrants, each containing a different figure, a human, an animal, a bird, and something shapeless. Beneath it, Frederick had scrawled, 4 keepers, 1 key. Donald remembered seeing, more than once, men in long dark coats visiting the house after the warehouse renovation in '53. He had overheard fragments of their conversations, something about an obligation carried in the bloodline. The final entry was dated 1959. They say it is time to prepare the next one. They say the boy must know where not to look. I told them he is still a child. They said, he is already on their list. The attic dust seemed heavier as Donald closed the notebook. From that day forward, he became quietly obsessed with the container. He pressed his father for details, where it was, who had it. But Frederick always answered vaguely, deflecting questions or changing the subject. Then, according to one distant relative, Donald learned the truth. The container was no longer in New York. It had been moved to an undisclosed location, known to only 3 people in the country. It was in that moment, the relative said, that Donald's path diverged from the public story of the Trump family. Real estate and business were the visible face. Beneath it ran the other line, the hidden inheritance, the role of keeper for something that might not belong to this world at all. 1973. Donald Trump was 27, already maneuvering through New York's volatile real estate market with a mix of ambition and calculated charm. But behind the negotiations and construction sites, the quiet obsession that had haunted him since his teenage years refused to fade. For more than a decade, he had searched for a living thread connecting him to the events of 1953, the year of the sealed room, the container, and his father's guarded warnings. The trail was cold until he found a name in the back of Frederick Trump's notebook, Harold Mace. The notes were sparse. 3rd handler, survived, written in Frederick's hand. But they stood out. Of the 3 men who had physically moved the container in 1953, 2 had vanished within months. Mace was the only one who, on paper, had lived on. Yet after 1955, there was no trace of him in any public record. No tax filings, no address, nothing but silence. Donald's search took months of quiet inquiries, old contacts, and discreet payments to private investigators. Eventually, the pieces formed a location, a decaying farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, miles from the nearest town, where electricity had long since been cut. Locals called Mace that strange one who burns things in the yard at night. They claimed they had seen him hauling out warped bits of metal and splintered wood, piling them high and setting them alight until sparks hissed into the dark. Donald drove there himself. The house leaned slightly to one side, its porch sagging under the weight of years. To the left of the front steps lay a twisted heap of scrap metal, shattered frames, corroded hinges, warped panels that could have once been the sides of shipping crates. Some pieces looked eerily similar to the wartime containers Donald had seen in photographs, but melted and bent as if from heat no furnace could produce. Inside, the air was thick with the tang of rust and smoke. Every surface wore a fur of dust. The walls were scrawled with charcoal drawings, circles intersecting at impossible angles, jagged lines, distorted human figures with blurred, indistinct faces. Mace was gaunt, his eyes sunken yet piercing. His voice was dry as paper. When Donald asked about the container, he gave only one answer, repeated twice. Nothing happened. There was nothing. It's all a story. But Donald noticed something Mace did not seem aware of, or perhaps was guarding. As he spoke, the old man's hand rested on a tarnished medallion hanging from his neck. When Mace stepped outside to fetch water from a rain barrel, Donald examined it more closely. The design was unmistakable, a circle divided into 4 equal quadrants, each holding a distinct symbol, the same 4 keepers emblem sketched in Frederick's notebook. That evening, as Donald prepared to leave, Mace paused in the doorway. His face was in shadow, but his voice had a strange weight to it, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere far behind his eyes. You think it belonged to them? No. They belong to it. And if you learn what's inside, your blood becomes the key. Without another word, he stepped back into the darkened hall and disappeared from sight. Donald waited, unsure if Mace would return, then turned and walked into the cool Pennsylvania night. He drove away with more questions than answers, but one thing had crystallized in his mind. The link between the container and the Trump family was not coincidence. It was inheritance, deliberate, chosen, perhaps generations deep. Back in New York, Donald began combing through archives and private collections, looking for the medallion's emblem. His search eventually led to a grainy photograph dated 1922, his grandfather, standing beside the container itself. In his hands, unmistakably, was the very same medallion Harold Mace had worn. It was then that Donald understood. Whatever the container was, it had been in his family's possession for far longer than he had been told. And the four keepers were not just symbols, they were roles. One of them, whether he liked it or not, might one day be his. By the end of 1974, Donald Trump had gathered enough fragments of the story to chart a route. Old entries from Navy warehouse logs, scraps of police reports, and notes from Frederick's tattered journal all pointed to one location, a wooded tract northwest of Pittsburgh. On official maps, the area was marked only as private property of a company dissolved in 1949. Donald went there in winter, when the ground lay hidden under a crust of snow, and the air was thick and dry. The road ended nearly a kilometer before the coordinates he had marked. From there, it was only trees, the crunch of ice underfoot, and his breath in the cold air. Through the skeletal branches, he could see them. Concrete walls streaked with moss, the remains of old storage buildings. Inside one of the half-collapsed hangars, he found a hatch set into the floor. The metal lid was orange with rust, but the lock on it looked disturbingly new. He forced it open, and a wave of stench rolled up from below, a nauseating blend of rot and cold iron. The ladder dropped into a narrow underground corridor. The cement walls were studded with handprints, as if pressed into the surface decades ago before the concrete had set. But the impressions were wrong, too long, the fingers jointed in ways human hands were not. At the corridor's end, it waited. The container. Black, its recessed panels swallowing the beam of his flashlight, and in the center, the same symbol. But here, the mark seemed cut deeper than in the photograph from 1922, as if someone had kept carving at it over the years, pushing it further into the metal. Donald felt the hum, not a sound exactly, but a vibration running through his bones, emanating from the container's frame. Each step closer was harder than the last, the air seeming to grow denser around him. He reached out toward the surface and noticed fresh scratches along one of the panels, the marks sharp and clean, as though someone had tried to pry it open not long ago. On the floor beside it lay something wrapped in a sheet of old canvas. Peeling back the fabric, Donald uncovered a medallion, identical to the one Harold Mace had worn. Inside its cover, an inscription in a language he could not read was cut deep into the metal. That was when he knew he wasn't alone. From somewhere in the darkness, a faint tapping began. Slow, steady. Not footsteps. Not echo. It was coming from inside the container, each knock deliberate, as if something, or someone, was marking time. Donald didn't open it. He walked out. But now he understood. Whatever the container was, it was still active. And judging by the scratches and the sound, something inside was trying to get out. Early 1975. Donald Trump had learned by now that charging headfirst into the mystery was dangerous. The failed conversation with Harold Mace still lingered in his mind, along with the image of the medallion and the words, "Your blood becomes the key." This time, he would proceed with caution. Through quiet inquiries in the construction industry and a few favors owed, Donald made contact with two men whose credentials reached into the sealed corridors of the defense sector. Howard Langley, a physicist with classified materials research experience, and Joseph Carpenter, a systems engineer who had once worked on experimental containment projects for the Navy. They agreed to meet only under strict conditions: no written records, no photographs, and no mention of names in any official context. They wanted nothing traceable, not even the location. The rendezvous took place at a privately leased hangar northwest of Pittsburgh. It was an unassuming building from the outside, its corrugated walls blending into the winter landscape. But beneath it, hidden behind a locked freight elevator and a corridor of reinforced concrete, was the room Donald had arranged for them to see. Even before reaching the container, both men seemed unsettled. Langley's breathing grew heavier, as though the air itself resisted him. Carpenter kept glancing over his shoulder, frowning into empty space, muttering that someone's right there. They began their inspection. Langley knelt with a portable spectrometer, adjusting its narrow scanning arm toward the surface of the container. The device powered on, then instantly failed. The screen fractured from the inside with a spiderweb crack, and a thin frost bloomed along the interior components, even though the underground air was mild. Carpenter approached with a magnetic thickness gauge, intending to test the density of the metal. As soon as the sensor made contact, it wrenched itself from his grip and slammed into the panel with a force far beyond its weight. He struggled to pry it off. The magnet held, as though the container had swallowed it. Minutes passed, and then, without any signal or prompt, their behavior shifted. Langley froze mid-step, staring at a point in the air several feet above the container. His lips moved, forming syllables that didn't belong to any language Donald knew. Rolling consonants, almost melodic, almost mechanical. Carpenter, without a word, placed his bare hand directly on the center symbol etched into the container's surface. His posture slackened, his breathing slowed, and for a moment, he looked more like a man listening than touching. That's when the lights died. Donald's flashlight beam cut through the sudden black, jittering as his pulse quickened. The container was glowing, not brightly, but with a muted, rhythmic pulse. And that pulse, it matched something he'd heard before, a faint, steady tapping that seemed to come from deep within the metal. The light returned in less than a second. Langley and Carpenter were gone, completely gone. No footsteps leading out, no sound of movement, no lingering breath in the cold air. Only their tools remained, scattered where they'd been working, and two empty protective suits lying collapsed on the floor, their gloves turned upward, as if they'd been set down gently. Donald's eyes locked on the container. It hadn't moved. But something was different. New marks scored its surface, deep scratches radiating outward from the central symbol, reaching toward the edges in jagged lines. They hadn't been there before. Later, Donald would replay the scene in his mind over and over. He would ask himself whether Langley and Carpenter had touched something invisible, stepped into some unseen space, or whether the container itself had taken them. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. The inheritance was no longer a dormant legacy. It was active, and it had just claimed two more names. Spring, 1975. The disappearance of Langley and Carpenter changed something in Donald. Up until that night, he had thought of the container as an enigma, a puzzle that might yield to cleverness, resources, and the right kind of force. Now he understood it for what it was, a living problem, one that could not be taken apart like a piece of real estate. For weeks, he tried to bury himself in business, meetings, contracts, new properties. On the surface, his life moved forward. But the container pulled at the back of his mind like a nail under the skin. Every news headline about a missing person, every whispered report of strange lights over rural towns, every mention of distant thunder with no storm. It all felt connected to the thing buried under concrete in northwestern Pennsylvania. Then came the letter. No postage. No return address. No postmark. The envelope had simply appeared, slipped under his office door while he was away at lunch. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for one thing: the same carved symbol from the container's face, printed in dark ink, and below it, 6 words. Soon, you will be the keeper. That evening, Donald returned to his office late. The room was empty. except for the object lying squarely in the center of his desk. The medallion. The same one Harold Mace had worn when he muttered his cryptic warning. The same medallion Donald had never been able to find again. It was cold. Colder than the metal should have been in the warm air of the office. When he turned it over, he saw a fresh engraving on the inner face. 1921. The date his family's involvement had begun. And beside it, an empty space, deliberately left for the next date. It didn't take long for him to understand the message. The chain of keepers was still intact. He was next, not by choice, but by the design of something older and more deliberate than his will. Donald decided then. The container had to be destroyed. The attempts came quickly. Construction equipment, industrial drills, even controlled demolition charges. Nothing worked. The metal would not cut, bend, or crack. And worse, the machinery itself seemed to revolt in the container's presence. Engines stalled, hydraulic systems locked, control panels burned out with the smell of scorched copper. One night, driving alone toward the site, Donald noticed headlights behind him in the rearview mirror, a black sedan, running without its lights. It followed him for 20 miles along the empty back roads. When he reached the hangar and stepped out of his car, the road behind him was empty. No sound. No tail lights fading in the dark. Just gone. Inside the underground corridor, the container was different. The panels did not align perfectly anymore. The seam along the upper edge was open, no more than the width of a fingernail, but open. From that gap came a slow, cold draft. And underneath it, almost masked by the air's chill, came something else. Breathing. Low. Steady. Rhythmic. Donald locked the hatch. Then he barricaded the entrance with stacked concrete blocks until the corridor looked like the wall of a tomb. And still, as he drove away, he knew it was not gone, only waiting. The last image tied to this period comes from a photograph dated 1981. Taken somewhere in the same region, it shows a young man in a tailored business suit standing before a bricked-over doorway. The face is blurred, lost in the overexposed grain of the print. In his hand is the medallion. The symbol is unmistakable. Written on the back of the photograph in neat block letters. The inheritance is not for sale. It chooses for itself.